It's been 2 years since that day, but the memories still haunt me. I'll never forget that crisp October evening when everything changed. My apartment was on the ground floor of an old brick building, overlooking a narrow alley that rarely saw sunlight. I'd always found a strange comfort in its quietness, away from the city's constant hum. That night, I was working late on a project, the soft glow of my laptop the only light in the room. It was just past midnight when I first felt it, that prickling sensation of being watched. I brushed it off, blaming it on too much coffee and too little sleep. But then I saw it. A face in the window. Pale, almost translucent, with eyes that seemed to bore right through me. It was there for just a second, a fleeting reflection in the darkness beyond the glass. I blinked, and it was gone. Heart racing, I rushed to the window, peering out into the alley. Nothing. Just the usual shadows and a stray cat darting behind a dumpster. I laughed nervously, running a hand through my hair. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. "You're seeing things." But as I turned back to my work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The apartment felt different, as if the air itself had become heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I tried to focus on my project, but my eyes kept darting to the window, half expecting to see that face again. Eventually, I gave up, drawing the curtains and retreating to my bedroom. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I rationalized the experience. Stress, lack of sleep, and overactive imagination. Surely that explained it. If only I had known then what that single moment would lead to. If only I had packed my bags and left that very night. But I didn't. I stayed, convincing myself it was nothing. And in doing so, I opened the door to a nightmare that would consume my life for months to come. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't have imagined that this was just the beginning. That face in the window was about to become my own personal horror story, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality and my own sanity. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that the face in the window had been nothing more than a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination born from exhaustion. But as October wore on, that comforting illusion began to unravel. It started with small things. Shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The feeling of eyes on me whenever I turned my back to the window. I began to dread nightfall, drawing the curtains tightly as soon as dusk settled over the city. But the curtains weren't enough. A week after the first incident, I saw him again. This time, there was no mistaking it for a fleeting reflection. I was washing dishes, my hands deep in soapy water, when movement caught my eye. I looked up, and there he was, pressed against the glass. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. Black, empty voids that seemed to drink in the light around them. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, his gaze boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, dishes clattering into the sink. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, he was gone. But the impression of those eyes remained, burned into my memory. The appearances became more frequent after that. Sometimes just a glimpse as I walked past a window. Other times, a prolonged presence, watching me as I moved about my apartment. I began to structure my life around avoiding windows, plastering newspapers over every glass surface in a desperate attempt to block his gaze. Sleep became elusive. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the windows, jolted me awake. I'd lie there in the dark, heart pounding, straining my ears for any sound that might indicate his presence. The worst were the nights when I'd wake to the sound of scratching. Soft at first, barely audible, then growing louder. fingernails on glass, tracing slow, deliberate patterns. I'd pull the covers over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. It always did, eventually. But the silence that followed was almost worse, heavy with anticipation of what might come next. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that stress and lack of sleep were causing me to hallucinate. But the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. One morning, I found long, deep scratches on the outside of my bedroom window. Another day, a handprint appeared on the bathroom mirror, too large and misshapen to be my own. My world was shrinking, confined to the spaces in my apartment furthest from windows. But even there, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. He was always there, just out of sight, waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that sooner or later, he would find a way in. As the days turned into weeks, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. I found myself questioning everything, doubting my own senses. But the evidence was mounting, becoming impossible to ignore or explain away. One morning, I woke to find a series of strange markings on the windowsill. They looked like symbols, etched into the wood with something sharp. I didn't recognize them from any language I knew, but they filled me with an inexplicable dread. I scrubbed at them furiously, but they remained stubbornly visible, a constant reminder of the terror that lurked just outside. The sounds at night grew more frequent and varied. Beyond the scratching, I began to hear whispers, low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They were unintelligible, but the malice in them was unmistakable. Sometimes, I'd catch what sounded like my own name, spoken in a voice that was a grotesque parody of human speech. Objects in my apartment started to move. At first, it was subtle, a book out of place, a chair slightly askew. But it escalated quickly. One evening, I returned from a rare outing to find every piece of furniture in my living room facing the windows, as if an audience arranged for some macabre performance. The most chilling discovery came on a rainy Tuesday morning. As I stepped out of the shower, I noticed something on the steamed-up mirror. As the condensation cleared, a message emerged, written in reverse as if scrawled from the other side of the glass. "I see you always." I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. The bathroom door was locked, the window sealed shut. There was no way anyone could have entered to leave this message. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the words began to drip and distort, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. My mind raced, trying to find logical explanations. Was I sleepwalking? Suffering from some sort of dissociative episode? The alternative, that something truly supernatural was happening, was too terrifying to contemplate. I started keeping a journal, documenting every incident in meticulous detail. Perhaps if I could see it all laid out, some pattern would emerge, some clue to help me understand what was happening. But as the pages filled with accounts of impossible sightings and inexplicable events, I found myself facing a horrifying question. Was I losing my grip on reality? Or was reality itself unraveling around me? As I penned each entry, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer just documenting these events. I was leaving a record, a testament to whatever fate awaited me. And somewhere, just beyond the veil of normalcy, he was watching, waiting for the moment when the barrier between us would finally break. As the terror in my apartment intensified, I realized I couldn't face this alone anymore. My first instinct was to call the police. I dialed the non-emergency number, my hands shaking as I recounted the strange occurrences to the dispatcher. The officer who arrived seemed sympathetic at first, but as he walked through my apartment, finding no signs of forced entry and no tangible evidence of an intruder, his demeanor changed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a mixture of condescension and concern, Have you been under any unusual stress lately? Or perhaps not sleeping well? His implication was clear. He thought I was imagining things, or worse, that I was unstable. Desperate for someone to believe me, I turned to my neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the hall listened patiently but suggested that perhaps I was working too hard. Young people these days, always pushing themselves too far, she clucked, pressing a plate of cookies into my hands as if sweets could ward off the nightmare I was living. My friend Sarah was more supportive, at least at first. She came over, helped me check the locks, even stayed the night once. But nothing happened when she was there. The face in the window, the scratching sounds, the moving objects, all remained eerily absent. After a while, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes, her suggestions of maybe seeing a therapist becoming more frequent. Feeling increasingly isolated, I turned to the internet, spending sleepless nights scrolling through forums and chat rooms dedicated to paranormal experiences. I found stories similar to mine. Tales of shadowy figures, unexplained phenomena, lives disrupted by unseen forces. For a brief moment, I felt less alone. But as I dug deeper, I encountered just as many skeptics, people quick to dismiss these experiences as hoaxes or delusions. In a last-ditch effort, I even consulted a local psychic. The woman, draped in colorful scarves, entered my apartment and immediately went pale. "There's a darkness here," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the windows. For a fleeting moment, I felt validated. But when she started talking about cleansing rituals and protective crystals, my heart sank. This wasn't the help I needed. As I thanked her and showed her out, I caught a glimpse of movement in the window reflection. The familiar pale face, those hollow eyes, watching. A chill ran down my spine as I realized a terrifying truth. In this nightmare, I was utterly alone. The day it all came to a head started like any other in my new, fear-filled reality. I woke from a fitful sleep, my body tense, eyes immediately darting to the covered windows. The weight of constant vigilance had left dark circles under my eyes and a perpetual tremble in my hands. As evening approached, an oppressive stillness settled over the apartment. The usual sounds of the city seemed muffled, as if my home existed in a bubble, separate from the world outside. I paced restlessly, checking and rechecking the locks, adjusting the makeshift coverings over the windows. Something felt different. The air was thick, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been building to this night. As darkness fell, I began my nightly ritual of fortification. I wedged chairs under doorknobs, lined salt along the windowsills, a desperate measure gleaned from late-night internet searches, and clutched a kitchen knife as I made my final rounds. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. The slow, deliberate scrape of fingernails on glass, louder than ever before. It came from the living room window, the one overlooking the alley. My heart pounding, I crept towards the sound, knife gripped tightly in my sweating palm. The scratching grew more insistent, accompanied now by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. I stood frozen before the covered window, torn between the urge to flee and a morbid need to confront whatever lurked on the other side. With a trembling hand, I reached for the edge of the newspaper I'd taped over the glass. Before I could pull it away, there was a deafening crash. Shards of glass exploded inward, slicing through the paper covering. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of a pale, elongated arm reaching through the broken window, fingers unnaturally long and tipped with sharp, blackened nails. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. The arm withdrew, and for a moment, all was still. Then, slowly, a figure began to pull itself through the shattered window. It was him, the face that had haunted my nights for weeks. But seeing him in full was far worse than any glimpse I'd caught before. His body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over an impossibly tall frame. He moved with an unnatural fluidity, limbs bending at odd angles as he slithered into my living room. But it was his face that paralyzed me with terror. Up close, I could see that his eyes weren't just black. They were endless voids, seeming to pull the light from the room. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. He took a step towards me, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The knife slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. My body finally responded to the screaming in my mind. Run! I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the locks. I could hear him behind me, his breathing a wet, rasping sound that raised goosebumps on my skin. Just as I felt his cold fingers brush the back of my neck, I wrenched the door open and burst into the hallway. I ran like I'd never run before, down the stairs, out of the building, into the empty street. My bare feet slapped against the cold pavement as I fled into the night, his inhuman shriek echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached Sarah's apartment building, my lungs burning, tears streaming down my face. As I pounded on her door, I glanced back the way I'd come, half expecting to see that nightmarish figure loping down the street after me. But there was nothing, just the quiet of a city night, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant wail of a siren. Sarah's face when she opened the door was a mixture of shock and concern. I must have been a frightening sight, disheveled, barefoot, and wild-eyed. She ushered me in without a word, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders as I collapsed onto her couch, shaking uncontrollably. It took me nearly an hour to calm down enough to speak coherently. When I finally managed to recount the night's events, I saw the doubt creep into Sarah's eyes. She listened patiently, but I could tell she was struggling to believe me. "Maybe it was a nightmare," she suggested gently. "You've been under so much stress lately." I wanted to scream in frustration. How could I make her understand the terror I'd experienced, the very real danger I'd narrowly escaped? But looking at my reflection in her hallway mirror, pale, unkempt, with a wild look in my eyes, I began to doubt myself. Had it all been a vivid hallucination brought on by weeks of fear and sleepless nights? The next few days at Sarah's apartment were a blur of fitful sleep and paranoid vigilance. Every shadow made me jump, every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. Sarah did her best to comfort me, but I could sense her growing unease with my presence and erratic behavior. On the third day, Sarah gently suggested that we return to my apartment, accompanied by her boyfriend, Mike. "We'll check everything out," she assured me. "If there's any evidence of what happened, we'll find it. And if not, well, maybe it's time to consider talking to someone professional about what you've been experiencing." I nodded numbly, knowing this was a turning point. Either I would find proof of my tormentor's existence, or I would have to face the possibility that the true horror resided within my own mind. The walk back to my apartment felt like a journey to the gallows. Each step closer intensified my dread, memories of that terrifying night flashing through my mind. Sarah and Mike flanked me, their presence both comforting and somehow isolating. I knew they couldn't truly understand my fear. As we approached my building, I half expected to see shattered glass and police tape. Instead, everything looked normal, unsettlingly so. We climbed the stairs, my heart pounding louder with each step. When we reached my door, I hesitated, key in hand. Mike gave me an encouraging nod, and with a deep breath, I unlocked it. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it, except it wasn't. The window, which I vividly remembered being smashed to pieces, was intact. The furniture was in its usual place, not strewn about as it had been during my frantic escape. There were no shards of glass, no sign of struggle. Sarah and Mike exchanged glances as they inspected the apartment. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind reeling. Had I imagined it all? It was Mike who noticed it first. On the living room mirror, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "Welcome back. I've been waiting." The color drained from Sarah's face. Mike cursed under his breath. I felt a chilling mix of vindication and renewed terror. He was real. He had been here. And he was expecting me. That blood-scrawled message was the final straw. Within 48 hours, I had packed my essential belongings and booked a one-way ticket to a city on the other side of the country. I couldn't bear to stay in that apartment, in that city, for another moment. My new life is quieter. I found a top-floor apartment with minimal windows, all of which remained shuttered. I work from home, avoiding reflective surfaces and never going out after dark. But the peace is fragile. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I hear familiar scratching sounds. And every so often, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a pale face watching me from impossible angles. I know now that no matter how far I run, the terror of that October will always be with me, waiting just beyond the veil of normalcy, ready to pull me back into its nightmare at any moment. I never thought I'd share this story, but after 5 years, the weight of keeping it to myself has become unbearable. Before everything happened, I was just a regular software developer who'd recently inherited an old Victorian house from my Aunt Claire. The house was beautiful, with its long corridors and antique furnishings. But looking back, I should have noticed something wasn't quite right from the beginning. It started on a Tuesday night in March. The kind of night where silence feels like a living thing, pressing against your ears. I'd been living alone in the house for about 3 months, finally settling into a routine after spending weeks sorting through Aunt Claire's belongings. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m., my throat dry as sandpaper. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I made my way to the kitchen, passing through the main corridor with its row of ornate mirrors, a collection my aunt had been oddly proud of. I was halfway down the corridor when something made me stop. You know that feeling when your peripheral vision catches something wrong? It was like that, but stronger. I turned to face the largest mirror, an enormous Victorian piece with an intricate golden frame. My reflection was there, normal as ever, until I raised my right hand to scratch my chin. In the mirror, my reflection raised its left hand. I froze. The house's heating system hummed quietly in the background as I stood there, heart thundering in my chest. I blinked several times, convinced my sleep-addled brain was playing tricks on me. That's when my reflection smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched far beyond what any human face should manage. My own expression was locked in horror. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. I went about my day, attending virtual meetings, coding, ordering takeout, normal things that normal people do. But as evening approached, I found myself avoiding the corridor mirrors, taking alternate routes through the house. When I had to pass them, I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, ignoring the growing sensation that something was watching me. Over the next few days, small things began to change. I'd catch glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces, not just the corridor mirrors, but in windows, the TV screen when it was turned off, even the smooth surface of my coffee in the morning. The worst part was how subtle it all was. A slight delay in the reflections movement here, a minor discrepancy there. Things so small that telling anyone would make me sound paranoid. I started keeping a journal, documenting every incident. March 15th. Bathroom mirror reflection blinked while I was washing face. March 17th. Kitchen window reflection turned head slightly left while I was looking right. The entries grew longer, more frequent. I began taking different routes through the house, mapping out paths that avoided reflective surfaces. But the house, with its Victorian architecture and my aunt's obsession with mirrors, made this nearly impossible. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake, listening to the house settle, wondering if the sounds I heard were really just the old structure creaking. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I'd hear what sounded like fingernails lightly scratching against glass, but when I gathered the courage to check, the mirrors would be still, showing only my haggard reflection staring back with increasingly dark circles under its eyes. The breaking point came exactly 2 weeks after that first incident. I'd been working late, my laptop screen casting a pale glow in my home office. As I stood to stretch, my reflection in the decorative mirror above my desk remained seated for a full second before rising. I wasn't even surprised anymore, just exhausted and increasingly terrified. That night, I decided to document everything on video. I set up my phone to record the hallway mirror, hoping to capture proof of what I was experiencing. The footage showed nothing but normal reflections, yet I knew what I was seeing with my own eyes was different. When I reviewed the recordings, they would glitch and distort whenever something strange should have been visible. Technology, it seemed, couldn't capture whatever was happening. The reflections grew bolder. They began moving independently when I was clearly watching them, no longer trying to hide their autonomy. The worst was their smiles, those horrible knowing smiles that would appear when no one else was around. Sometimes, when I walked past the mirrors quickly, my reflection would turn to watch me go, its head rotating at an impossible angle. I tried covering the mirrors with sheets, but each morning I'd find the covers on the floor, with no memory of how they got there. The reflections seemed angry about my attempts to hide them, their movements becoming more aggressive, their smiles more sinister. The first physical evidence appeared on a rainy Sunday morning. I noticed something odd on the surface of the hallway mirror. A series of smudges that looked disturbingly like handprints, but they were pressing outward, as if something was trying to push through from the other side. I touched the glass, and it was ice cold, even though the house was warm. Strange sounds began echoing through the house at night. The scratch of nails against glass grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes I'd hear whispers that seemed to come from within the mirrors themselves, distorted versions of my own voice having conversations I couldn't quite make out. My attempts to document these phenomena became increasingly desperate. Every camera I set up would malfunction, batteries draining inexplicably. Photos came out blurred or completely black, and video recordings would show nothing but static when played back. The few images I did manage to capture showed something that made my blood run cold. In every reflection, my eyes were completely black. I stopped leaving my bedroom except when absolutely necessary. Food deliveries piled up at my front door as I worked remotely, using the excuse of illness to avoid video calls. The few friends who tried to check on me received brief texts assuring them I was fine. But I wasn't fine. The mirrors were watching, waiting, and I knew something was coming. I could feel it in the way my reflections would gather at the edges of their glass prisons, pressing against an increasingly thin barrier between their world and mine. It happened 3 months after the first incident. I'd finally fallen into an exhausted sleep when a sound jolted me awake. The distinctive crack of breaking glass. Not just from one direction, but from everywhere in the house. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the time on my phone. 3 a.m., exactly like that first night. The sound of shattering mirrors echoed through the corridors, accompanied by something worse. The soft pad of footsteps, moving in ways that defied the house's layout. In the dim moonlight filtering through my window, I could see handprints appearing on my bedroom mirror, pressing outward, the glass bulging impossibly. I watched, paralyzed, as cracks spread across every reflective surface in my room. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and through the fracturing glass, I saw my reflection grinning at me. But it wasn't alone anymore. Behind it stood countless versions of myself, all with those same twisted smiles, all reaching forward. When the mirrors finally shattered, I ran. Behind me, I heard the sound of multiple sets of footsteps hitting the floor, accompanied by the whisper of my own voice, multiplied and distorted. I never returned to that house. The police report listed it as vandalism, every mirror in the house shattered, with inexplicable handprints pressed outward from within the glass. They never found who did it, of course. How could they? These days, I live in a small apartment with no mirrors. I cover all reflective surfaces and avoid looking at windows at night. But sometimes, walking past shop windows or catching a glimpse of myself in someone's sunglasses, I see it, that familiar smile that isn't mine, watching, waiting. And I wonder, which one of us actually escaped that night? Am I still me, or am I one of them, living someone else's life, while the real me remains trapped behind the glass? Looking back now, 8 months later, I still question everything that happened in my grandmother's house. Before all this, I was just a simple art teacher in Madrid, living a predictable life filled with watercolors and chattering students. When I received the news of my grandmother Elena's passing and the subsequent inheritance of her Victorian house, I never imagined it would lead me down such a dark path. The house stood on the outskirts of Toledo, a 3-story testament to old Spanish architecture, with its weathered stone walls and elaborate ironwork. I'd visited occasionally as a child, but grandmother had become reclusive in her later years, politely declining my visits. Now, as I turned the ancient key in the lock that first day, the familiar scent of aged wood and lavender brought back memories I'd almost forgotten. The first few days were spent sorting through her belongings, each room a museum of her long life. But it was the attic that changed everything. I found it on my 3rd day, while clearing out old furniture and dust-covered boxes. The music box sat on a shelf near the window, moonlight catching its golden details as if it had been waiting for me. It was exquisite, porcelain and gold, with intricate floral patterns and a delicate ballerina poised eternally en point. Something about it called to me, perhaps its obvious age or the craftsmanship. Without much thought, I carried it down to my new bedroom. That decision would haunt me for months to come. The first incident occurred that very night. I had placed the music box on my bedside table, admiring how the ballerina seemed to catch every hint of light in the room. I hadn't wound it up, unsure if its ancient mechanism would still work. That's why, when I jolted awake at precisely 2:37 a.m. to the sound of music, my blood ran cold. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a haunting waltz that seemed to exist somewhere between a lullaby and a funeral dirge. The notes hung in the air like frost, each one crystal clear yet somehow wrong. I lay there, paralyzed, watching the ballerina rotate smoothly on her axis, though I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't wound the mechanism. When I finally gathered my courage and reached for the box, the music stopped abruptly. The ballerina stood frozen, but not in her original position. Her arms were slightly lower, her head tilted at an angle I didn't remember. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, enhanced by the shadows and my half-awake state. I placed the box in my drawer, telling myself I'd examine it properly in the morning. But morning brought no answers, only more questions. The box appeared completely normal in daylight, beautiful, antique, but ordinary. I even wound it up, and it played a simple, traditional melody, nothing like the eerie waltz from the night before. I almost convinced myself it had been a dream, until the next night, when at exactly 2:37 a.m., the music began again. As the days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged. Every night, without fail, the music would start at 2:37 a.m. The melody never changed, but it seemed to grow louder, more insistent with each passing night. I found myself dreading bedtime, lying awake in anticipation of those first haunting notes. But the music was just the beginning. I started noticing other things, small at first, but impossible to ignore as time went on. The ballerina's pose would change slightly each day. Sometimes her arms would be raised higher, other times her head would be turned at an unnatural angle. I tried marking her position with a pencil, only to find the marks erased the next morning. One night, about a month after I'd found the box, I woke to the music as usual. But this time, something was different. The ballerina was moving, not just rotating on her base, but dancing. Her tiny porcelain limbs moved with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible. Her face, once a peaceful, painted smile, now alive with an expression of sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I tried to get rid of the box after that. I buried it in the garden, only to find it back on my nightstand the next morning, covered in dirt. I locked it in the attic, but its melody still reached me, muffled but persistent. Each attempt to be free of it only seemed to make its presence stronger, more determined. It was during one of my attempts to research the box's history that I first noticed the footprints. I had been spending long hours in the attic, sifting through my grandmother's old papers, hoping to find some clue about the box's origin. As I moved a stack of dusty photo albums, I saw them, tiny footprints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. They were unmistakably a child's, forming perfect circles as if someone had been dancing. My heart raced as I followed their path, leading from where the music box had originally sat to the attic door. But the trail didn't end there. As days passed, I began finding similar footprints throughout the house, in rarely used corners of the living room, along the upstairs hallway, and most disturbingly, forming a semicircle around my bed. Desperate for answers, I delved deeper into the house's history. I discovered that my grandmother had a younger sister, Marisol, who died as a child. The details were vague, but I found an old photograph of a little girl holding a music box, the very same one that now haunted my nights. As my research intensified, so did the occurrences. The music grew louder, and sometimes in the dead of night, I could swear I heard a child's laughter echoing through the empty halls. The ballerina's dance became more frantic, more desperate. And the footprints, they kept appearing night after night, inching closer to my bed. I knew I was no longer alone in that house. Something was trying to reach out, to communicate. But as the boundary between the past and present blurred, I found myself wondering, was I uncovering a long-buried secret, or was I losing my grip on reality? As my 6th month in the house approached, the phenomena reached a fever pitch. The music box's melody had become an omnipresent symphony, no longer confined to the witching hour. Even during the day, I could hear its faint whispers at the edge of my consciousness, a constant reminder of the unseen presence that shared my home. The footprints were now a nightly occurrence, appearing with alarming frequency and proximity. One morning, I woke to find them circling my bed, so close I could have reached out and touched them. The dust on my nightstand bore the imprint of small handprints, as if someone had been standing there, watching me sleep. Sleep deprivation and constant fear had taken their toll. I found myself jumping at shadows, convinced I could see movement in every reflective surface. More than once, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a small figure darting around corners or disappearing through doorways. But it was always gone when I turned to look directly. The ballerina's dance had become a nightly performance of anguish. Her tiny porcelain face contorted in expressions of sorrow and desperation that no inanimate object should have been capable of. I found myself transfixed by her movements, sensing an urgency in her dance, as if she were trying to convey a message I couldn't quite grasp. As the sun set on what would be my final night in that house, I felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that whatever had been building over these months was about to reach its climax. I didn't even try to sleep that night. I sat on my bed, eyes fixed on the music box, waiting. At exactly midnight, not 2:37 a.m. as before, the music began. It was louder than ever, filling the room with its haunting melody. The ballerina began to spin, faster and faster, her movements a blur of white porcelain. Then, in a moment that will forever be seared into my memory, she stepped off the base of the music box. I watched, paralyzed with equal parts terror and wonder, as the tiny figurine grew, transforming before my eyes into the spectral form of a young girl. She was translucent, glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Her face, so similar to the old photograph I'd found of Marisol, was a mask of sadness and longing. As she began to dance, the room around us seemed to fade away, replaced by glimpses of another time. Flashes of a happier past, of laughter and music, followed by moments of darkness and despair. I understood then, with perfect clarity, that I was witnessing Marisol's story. Her life, her untimely death, and her decades-long vigil, trapped between worlds. Her dance was both a plea and a farewell, a last desperate attempt to be remembered and understood. As the final notes of the music faded, Marisol's form began to dissolve. In that moment, driven by an impulse I couldn't explain, I reached out to her. Our hands met for the briefest instant, hers cold as ice, mine trembling with adrenaline, before she vanished completely. In the sudden silence, the music box shattered, exploding into countless shards of porcelain and clockwork. Epilogue. Echoes of the past dawn found me huddled in a corner, surrounded by the remnants of the music box. As sunlight filtered through the windows, I noticed something on the walls, delicate, childlike writing in a language I didn't recognize, scrawled in what looked like ash. I left the house that day and never returned. The writing remained a mystery, perhaps the final message from a soul finally at rest. To this day, I can't hear a music box without feeling a chill down my spine, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and what lies beyond. Some nights, I still wake at 2:37 a.m., half expecting to hear that haunting melody, and wondering if somewhere, somehow, Marisol is still dancing. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.